My dear brothers and sisters, this edition of A Taste of Sri Aurobindo is titled Action and Reaction in Karma Yoga. We all learnt in physics that the third law of motion is that every action leads to an equal and opposite reaction. Karma Yoga is, of course, the yoga of action, but then you might be wondering, is there a reaction to it? Before we go into that, the love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Delhi branch. Now, let me go to the passage of today from Sri Aurobindo's essays on the Gita, and then we shall see how the action in Karma Yoga does, in fact, lead to a reaction. This passage occurs on page 240 of my edition of essays on the Gita. The spirit of our action arises from the nature of our being and the inner foundation it has taken. But also, this nature is itself affected by the trend and spiritual effect of our action. A very great change in the spirit of our works changes the nature of our being and alters the foundation it has taken. It shifts the center of conscious force from which we act. If life and action were entirely illusory, as some would have it, if the spirit had nothing to do with works or life, this would not be so. But the soul in us develops itself by life and works, and not indeed so much the action itself. But the way of our soul's inner force of working determines its relations to the spirit. This is indeed the justification of Karma Yoga as a practical means of the higher self realization. Let me go over it slowly. The spirit of our action arises from the nature of our being and the inner foundation it has taken. Now, yoga is about a change in consciousness, and that consciousness depends upon how we perceive the world. And it is essentially a movement from perceiving the world in terms of separation, that is, seeing ourselves entirely separate and distinct from the rest of the creation, and therefore justifying that my needs and my aspirations come first. From this, we move towards a less and less self centered consciousness in which we start seeing the oneness, the interrelatedness that we have with the rest of the creation. And that is because we share a common source. We all are children of the same God. We are all manifestations of the same divine, different forms, but in a sense, we are one. Now, as we move from the separative consciousness towards this consciousness of oneness, the ego driven consciousness to the consciousness of love, our nature changes. It affects our behavior. As our nature changes, our behavior is different. And the one simple example would be that as we move from this uh, consciousness of separation towards the consciousness of oneness, we start feeling one with the animals who are also a part of the creation, the manifestations of the same divine, and therefore we may not like to inflict pain on the animals in any way, and certainly not for food. And therefore, there is a tendency to turn to vegetarian food. Well, that is true, but then is there a reaction? So, our consciousness affects our nature determines our action, but then what is the reaction? The reaction is that as we turn vegetarian, our consciousness shifts further towards the direction of oneness. And the result is that more and more of our behavior starts getting reflected in this sense of oneness, not just with animals, but also with the rest of the creation. It gets extrapolated, which means that uh, our nature determines our action, and that action in itself is affecting our nature. In other words, it is shifting our consciousness. So, if the nature is acting, if on the basis of our nature we are acting on a foundation of oneness, the action itself shifts our consciousness, our perception of the world towards oneness, so that now we start acting more and more out of the sense of oneness. That is the reaction to it. So the foundation of our further actions then now becomes this new consciousness than the one with which we started when we turned vegetarian. So let me now read it once again. The spirit of our action arises from the nature of our being and the inner foundation it has taken. So, not the action itself, not the outward action, but the motive, the spirit of our action. For example, turning vegetarian, if it is purely for health reasons, then it does not have the same implications as when turning vegetarian has its foundation in a sense of oneness. So, the spirit of our action, not just the action itself, but the spirit of our action, that is the spirit underlying the action, arises from the nature of our being and the inner foundation it has taken. So the foundation is in fact within, in terms of our consciousness, in terms of our habitual way of perceiving the world as something which is in which separativeness is a fundamental principle, or whether it is oneness that is the fundamental principle. Now, these are the two poles, and most of the time we are stationed at somewhere between these two extremes. But then, the place where we are situated, the foundation that determines the inner foundation that we have for what determines our nature, and that in turn determines our actions. So the spirit of our action arises from the nature of our being and the inner foundation it has taken, but also this nature is itself affected by the trend and spiritual effect of our action. So that is the reaction. So not only the action is affected, rather the spirit of the action is affected by the nature of our being and the inner foundation, but this nature is itself affected by the trend and spiritual effect of our action. So our action itself has a spiritual effect, and that in turn shifts our consciousness, and that in turn shifts our habitual nature. A very great change in the spirit of our works changes the nature of our being. So, particularly a major change in the spirit of our work, that is something which is rather, significant and reflects a great change in the spirit of our works. For example, somebody giving up a very lucrative job because he finds that that is all leading to self-centered action, and quitting that job, settling down for a, a big loss of income, and trying to do something which will be of use to his fellow beings, which will in some way help his fellow beings. Now, it's a major change. And this has come as a result of an inner change, which is towards the sense of oneness. Now, a very great change in the spirit of our works changes the nature of our being. So, this in turn will alter the foundation it has taken, and it shifts the center of conscious force from which we act. So, a great change in the spirit of our works changes the nature of our being, and that alters the foundation it has taken. That is the foundation that forms the basis of our action. And that in turn shifts the center of conscious force from which we act. So, it leads to a further change in the same direction. Now, after this, Sri Aurobindo uh, takes this. Of course, it's in continuation, but in another direction, which again is very important. If life and action were entirely illusory, as some would have it, if the spirit had nothing to do with works or life, this would not be so. Now, this is a common perception in that our worldly action, our worldly life, and what we see around us is illusory. It is not something which is everlasting or imperishable. That imperishable and everlasting reality is quite distinct from this Maya, from this illusory world and worldly life. And therefore, sometimes we tend to dismiss it as something which has nothing to do with the spirit. Spirit, is here the presence of the divine in the creation. and we feel that, well, that may be a theoretical sort of a concept, but it has nothing to do with the real life as it is lived in the world. And uh, we forget that our life and the way the world is constituted is also a manifestation of the divine, has been designed by the divine with a purpose, and it has a certain direction. So we just treat it as something entirely separate from the spirit, in spite of this theoretical concept that is, well, the spirit pervades all universe. The spirit of the creator is uh, everywhere. It permeates all its creation. It is all pervasive. So, in spite of all this, we sometimes treat life and action in the world as something illusory, as something with which spirit has nothing to do. But then, if this were so, then this action and reaction would not be possible, because our worldly action, like, say, turning vegetarian or quitting a lucrative job, this in turn is connecting us more and more with the universal spirit. So, it is the link between these worldly actions and our connection with the spirit, which shows that the spirit is not really distinct. So, if life and action were entirely illusory, as some would have it, if the spirit had nothing to do with works or life, this would not be so. This would not be so means that our worldly actions would not lead to a shift in consciousness, towards a shift in our nature, which in turn would affect our further actions. So, this type of an action and reaction would not be possible if the spirit and the worldly life were entirely distinct. But the soul in us develops itself by life and works, and not indeed so much the action itself. But the way of our soul's inner force of working determines its relations to the spirit. So, the soul in us develops itself by life and works, which means the soul shifts its self, that is, our consciousness shifts, our perception of the world shifts by life and works, by the way we live, by the actions that we perform. So, our actions and our work determines the direction in which our consciousness shifts, which in turn determines how our habitual nature shifts. So, but the soul in us develops itself by life and works. So, in fact, the worldly life and the actions are a vehicle, are the vehicle that we use for shifting the consciousness one way or the other. It can go down also through certain types of actions, but we are talking here of yoga, and yoga is about those actions which will shift the consciousness upwards, take it from a consciousness of separativeness towards a consciousness of oneness. But the soul in us develops itself by life and work. So, life and works are not only not illusory, they have been given to us with a purpose, because they can serve as that vehicle, appropriate choice of the works, and the spirit in which we do those works is the vehicle that we have in worldly life for shifting the consciousness upwards, which is the very purpose of life. Or, in simpler terms, the life and the worldly life that we get, the type of life that we get, makes us do certain types of actions. And if those actions are such, we deliberately make such choices that our actions are such that they shift the consciousness upwards, then this worldly life and these actions become the vehicle for a change in consciousness. So that is why we have been given this. So in fact, they are not only not separate from the spirit, they are not disconnected from the spirit, they are not disconnected from the goal of life. They are in fact the vehicle for that shift in consciousness, the type of shift in consciousness that is the very purpose of our life. But the soul in us develops itself by life and works. So, life and works are the means, the tools, the vehicle that we have for development of the soul, development of the consciousness. And not indeed so much the action itself, but the way of our soul's inner force of working determines its relation to the spirit. So, which way our consciousness will shift is determined not so much by the action itself, but the way of our soul's inner force of working. That is our habitual nature, the level of our consciousness, the motive, and the manner in which the work is done. That is what establishes this link with the spirit. Not indeed so much the action itself, that is, say, turning vegetarian. As I said, if the motive behind it is just better health, then it will not have the same effect as when the motive is oneness, a sense of oneness with the animal. And so, not the action itself, or say the reason for quitting a lucrative job is that one is disgusted, one is bored, one is tired, one has got sort of a burnout, one can't go on, one is trapped in a mechanical routine, which one doesn't like. So, if it is that sort of a motive, then again, it will not have the same effect as when the person feels that here, my the effect on my consciousness is not such that I'm becoming a better person. It is not taking me towards improvement, but in fact, it is perhaps taking me in just the opposite direction. So when a person starts perceiving that and therefore decides to quit that job and take up something else, which will be based more on a principle of uh, love for others, which has been in turn inspired by a sense of oneness, then the effect of quitting the job will be different. So, not indeed so much the action itself, but the way of our soul's inner force of working determines its relations to the spirit. Its relationship with the spirit, the direction in which our consciousness would shift. This is indeed the justification of karma yoga as a practical means of the higher self realization. So, it is this type of a relationship between our works and our worldly life that justifies karma yoga as a practical means. That is something which is inbuilt into the type of life that we live, into the work that we, in any case, habitually do. So, this is what becomes a justification of karma yoga as a very practical means. You see, if you were to depend only on knowledge or devotion, that might take us away from our ordinary worldly life. And therefore, it may not be practical for a lot of us. And therefore, this type of a relationship between the world and worldly life and our actions itself shifting our consciousness in the direction which is consistent with the principles of yoga. This becomes the justification of karma yoga as a practical means of the higher self-realization. That is, what is the self-realization? That is realizing the self, realizing who we truly are. We are truly not just the body and the mind, uh, with which we identify ourselves. We are, in fact, uh, the soul, which supports the body and the mind, of which the body and the mind are manifestations. The soul, which uses the body and the mind as tools. And it is because of the barrier which we have, one can say that in simple terms, that that barrier which has been created by our ego, which is a separative principle which has been planted in us. So the barrier created by the ego between the soul and the body and the mind with which we identify ourselves makes it difficult to act out of that sense of oneness. And yoga is about weakening this barrier so that the ego becomes more and more diffuse and eventually tends to disappear. So it is instead, and what does it get replaced by? It replaced by love. Love is inspired by oneness. So love is the antidote to ego. So all this can happen through our actions, through the work that we do, through the type of choices that we make while doing our work. That is what can bring about this type of a shift. And this is the justification of karma yoga as a practical means of the higher self realization. Let me go over it again. The spirit of our action arises from the nature of our being and the inner foundation it has taken. But also, this nature is itself affected by the trend and spiritual effect of our action. A very great change in the spirit of our works changes the nature of our being and alters the foundation it has taken. It shifts the center of conscious force from which we act. If life and action were entirely illusory, as some would have it, if the spirit had nothing to do with works or life, this would not be so. But the soul in us develops itself by life and works, and not indeed so much the action itself, but the way of our soul's inner force of working determines its relations to the spirit. This is indeed the justification of Karma Yoga as a practical means of the higher self realization. Now, from this, a question arises whether Karma Yoga in itself is an adequate path, whether by itself it will be enough to reach the final goal of self realization. To some extent, that is a moot point. Because even if the starting point is Karma Yoga and one does it in the true spirit of Karma Yoga as an instrument of the divine and as, as something which one has to offer to the divine, thanking the divine for all the abilities one has and the circumstances one has received from the divine for doing the work, and therefore offering the work to the divine. If one does it in the spirit of Karma Yoga, then that would be, in fact, to some extent, impossible without a certain amount of knowledge, knowledge of the deeper truths of existence, and without a sense of devotion to the divine. But then, as the person uh, uses Karma Yoga primarily Karma Yoga as the means for the growth of consciousness, more of knowledge would come through the action itself. More of devotion would develop through the actions. Now, how does more devotion develop? The person starts realizing more and more that although apparently I am doing the work, but not only the abilities and the circumstances have been given by the divine, when I'm totally absorbed and doing the work in the spirit of Karma Yoga, treating myself as a mere instrument of the divine, as a servitor of the divine, and doing something which is uh, inspired by a sense of love and oneness, when I'm doing that, the work, the quality of the work automatically improves. As if you know, something from the universal consciousness, the consciousness of the divine, is entering me and just acting through my hands. So if the person is a writer, then the best of words, euphonic expressions start descending as if from nowhere. And the first draft itself becomes almost the final draft, and then the person uh, after doing it realizes, how did it happen? When I started, I started with a prayer, uh, uh, connecting myself to the divine and telling the divine, well, this is something which is your work, and I'm trying to do it so that what I write helps my fellow beings also rise in their consciousness. I just did that. And then I have created something which I didn't believe I was capable of. And the person reads that same piece after 5 years, then he says, did I really write it? Am I capable of creating it? So he himself starts wondering. So, this type of things happening again and again itself inspires devotion and is itself also increasing the knowledge, because the person is becoming aware that yes, there is something beyond the obvious, something beyond what I see around me, a force which is invisible, hands which are invisible, but the force is very real, and those invisible hands can act through my hands, are acting through my hands. As that bhajan says, karte ho tum kanhaiya, naam mera ho raha hai. It is the divine who does everything, but somehow I'm getting identified with the work. So how funny. It's not really my work. So, then you start. So this brings in both additional knowledge, further knowledge of the deeper truths of existence, and the devotion also increases. So, therefore, the triune is in fact one. The path of action, the path of knowledge, and the path of devotion are not really separate. However, start with uh, action, enlightened by a bit of necessary knowledge, and lubricated with a bit of devotion is good enough. And gradually, more of knowledge and devotion will come in, and one will not be able to identify whether the person is on the path of action or knowledge or devotion. That's one of the important things, in fact, which Aurobindo brings out in Essays on the Gita, that the triune is one. The three streams, the stream of action and knowledge and devotion in the Gita, are only for convenience, because the inclinations and the temperament and the circumstances of different individuals are different. So the person can start on any of these three paths, depending upon all these individual circumstances and so on. But eventually, if the person walks long enough and sincerely enough on that path that he has started with, eventually he'll end up doing all the three. He'll start walking on all the three paths of yoga. So that is what happens even with karma yoga. So in a way, the question whether karma yoga alone is enough or we do also need knowledge and devotion, it's a moot point. If karma yoga is done truly in the spirit of karma yoga, it will be generally possible only if it is enlightened with a bit of knowledge and lubricated with a bit of devotion. And as the person continues to walk on this path, both devotion and knowledge would grow. So that is the action and reaction which we started talking about. Our actions lead to a reaction. We start with a certain level of consciousness. And if that consciousness is uh, uh, leading to an action which is inspired by love and oneness, it will shift the consciousness further in the same direction, a greater perception of oneness, a greater love, and more of actions which are inspired by this new motive. So that is the reaction. And now that will lead to further actions, which in turn will do the same. And this can go on. This is an endless process. Thank you.